everybody, and welcome back to World Talks, where every word matters. My name is Don Arleth. Now it's time to bring in our guest to discuss the situation in Crimea, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bohdan Nahaylo, editor-in-chief at Kyiv Post. Hello, Bohdan. Great to see you again. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Good to be with you again.
Yes. Now, concerning Crimea, we just saw this statement. This was made months ago back by General Ben Hodges. And of course, expectations and I think the picture about Crimea itself has somewhat changed. There were hopes that during the last counteroffensive last year, that in fact a wedge could be driven there to the Sea of Azov, cutting off the land bridge, and then potentially the Kerch Strait bridge could be taken out, and therefore Crimea would be essentially an island that would be untenable for Russian forces. But in the meantime, we've seen lots of successful attacks by the Ukrainians who have wreaked havoc on not only the Navy forces in the Sea of Azov in Crimea, making it untenable for them, but also these anti-air defense systems. So concerning Crimea, do you think that the progress that has been made by the Ukrainian Armed Forces is encouraging, to say the least?
I think that the progress is extremely encouraging, better than perhaps could have been hoped for. Look, Ukraine has been plagued with the issue of not having had until fairly recently long-range missiles, long-range artillery, the kind of long-range sea drones that it's managed to develop itself in certainly this year. So it has become very effective now in striking targets deep in Crimea and within Russia itself. This is a game changer. Now, the other thing is that the major thing, psychologically, not only in terms of a military, in terms of the psychological Russians themselves on the Kremlin, is that the Ukrainians have effectively driven the once mighty Russian Black Sea Fleet out of Crimea, out of Sevastopol. The Russian fleet, what's left of it in that part of the world, is hiding in Russian bases on the Black Sea. They are building a new naval base now in de facto occupied part of Georgia, in Abkhazia. This also is something that needs to be taken into account. So I also think that de facto, in reality, Crimea has become an island, even though the Russians in the north still maintain control of the land corridor linking Crimea to Russia proper.
Right, and now many have said that Russia could use nuclear weapons if Crimea would be taken back by Ukraine. Do you think that that is the case, or in fact what we're seeing now proves that, again, another red line was crossed already, and therefore there's no potential use of nuclear weapons when it comes to reoccupying Crimea, or taking it back, rather?
Yeah, I think this is a tactic that Russia uses to scare the West in particular, not so much the Ukrainians and their neighbors. It's this bluster, it's this appeal through the threat of terror and nuclear Armageddon aimed at certainly the Americans, I would say the BRICS countries, African countries, India, that, oh, look, there's a risk of nuclear war if Crimea falls. Let's go back a little bit, okay? And let's place it more in context. When Russia initially annexed Crimea, it did it in a very, shall we say, in a manner in which it was almost a shame to be seen to be occupying and seizing Crimea. Remember the green men, the anonymous people, armed people that suddenly appeared, and the pretense was that it was the local people that was somehow trying to welcome the Russians into Crimea rather than Russian military without uniforms, the green men taking control. Let's remember the Crimean Tatars. though a minority, they expressed strong support at the outset for Ukraine and belonging to Ukraine, and they have remained very loyal, and they've been subjected to intense repression and discrimination. Now, the other factor that I think needs to be brought into account and is often overlooked is that Crimea itself is situated as a key element if you want to control or have great influence over the Black Sea. So whatever happens in the Black Sea, Crimea is pivotal for that. So it's important not just for Ukraine, it's important for Turkey, for Bulgaria, for Romania. But the other factor that is often overlooked is that the Black Sea, and particularly around Crimea, is very rich resources, particularly gas. And it seems that one of the reasons why the Russians went into Crimea was not just out of imperialism for the sake of, controlling Ukraine, taking control of its history and culture, but if you want, positioning themselves for the next 20 or 30 years as problems with Siberian gas became more acute, to have new centers of energy deposits closer to Europe. So remember also that Donbass is probably around Slavyansk is the largest shale gas depository in Europe. So it's not simply coincidence, it's not simply military aggression. There was also, I think, the calculation that this expansion would bring energy dividends, economic dividends to Russia in the longer term.
And if Ukraine could control those resources, well, then it would obviously put Ukraine in a much better situation to determine its own future. Now, concerning President Zelensky's peace deal, which he is said to be preparing for potential talks eventually in November, where do you think the situation of territorial control lays in that peace plan? Do you think that it's going to be a non-starter for President Zelensky to cede any type of territory in any potential peace talks with Vladimir Putin?
Well, at this moment, and from the very outset, the position has been not to give any territory away, to return to the borders that were there in 1991 when Ukraine became independent, when Russia, the Russian Federation, and the UN recognized Ukraine's borders, and Poland was one of first, if not the first country to recognize Ukraine's borders and independence. So right now, it's not something for discussion. Right now, international law would demand that, would foresee that Russia withdraw from territories in Ukraine it has occupied, and then broader issues, security, long-term guarantees about no more aggression, war crimes issues, reparations, all those things would have to be put on the table and discussed. It's not simply a question of let's freeze, let's have a ceasefire. Russians will still control 20%, 15%, 10% of Ukraine, get away with murder, as it were, in reality.
There's an idea that's been floated that concerning Crimea, potentially it could be independent of Ukraine, independent of Russia, say for a decade, in order to facilitate peace with Russia and some kind of ceasefire that will have some kind of lasting effect. How do the Ukrainians see a scenario like that? Would that be something that would be possible, to have an independent governed Crimea?
I don't think at this stage that Ukrainians would countenance that. It's too much of a giveaway. It gets Russia off the hook, because it's not simply allowing an international body, shall we say, as under the League of Nations, to supervise a former colony. Crimea was part of and is part of Ukraine, and there is no reason to take a chunk of Ukraine, a very vital one, and say, well, let's for 10 years let's question its status, international law. Let's go back, let's turn the clock back and pretend that 1991 didn't happen, that there's no charter of the UN, etc. It's also, a kind of slap in the face for the international order and its system. So I don't think that that's on the cards. And look at the situation a little bit more broadly. Do you think the Turks are interested in Russia remaining in control in Crimea to the north of them? I don't think so. Do you think the Romanians and Bulgarians are? I don't think so. And look, in the 19th century, the big issue was control of the Dardanelles, in effect, control of the Black Sea, right? It linked with the future of the Ottoman Empire and whatnot. And that's why we had the Crimean War, which brought together old enemies, old former Napoleonic France, and they fought in Crimea to stop Russian expansion and control over the Black Sea. This is now being repeated to a large extent in Crimea itself, more broadly, not just in Sevastopol and where the charge of the Light Brigade legendary took place, etc. So, nothing much really has changed in terms of fighting against this threat from what used to be called the Russian bear. And now this Russian imperialism is still a threat to all in that area and beyond.
Bohdan Nahaylo, editor-in-chief at Kiev Post, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.